Well, well, well. Looks like we find ourselves here again, travelers. Tonight, I have something special for you. A brand new series, written by yours truly. So go on, pour yourself something strong, grab a snack, and settle down by the fire. Let the shadows dance just at the edge of your vision, because once this story begins, there's no turning back. Colin had been living in the Ozarks for 2 years, and in that time, exactly 4 people had come down his road uninvited. The first was a lost hunter in October of his first year, who took one look at Colin standing in the doorway and decided he wasn't that lost after all. The second and third were a pair of county sheriff's deputies doing a wellness check that someone in town had apparently requested on his behalf, which Colin found irritating since he didn't know anyone in town well enough for them to be worrying about him. He answered their questions, and they left. The fourth was a Jehovah's Witness, who he genuinely respected for making it 6 miles down an unmarked gravel road on pure faith alone. He took the pamphlet and wished her well. Other than those 4, nobody came down his road, and that was exactly how he liked it. He owned 43 acres of hardwood forest in the hill country of southern Missouri, deep enough into the Ozarks that the nearest town was a 20-minute drive on roads without painted lines. The cabin sat in a natural clearing at the end of a gravel track that wound down from the county road through white oak and shortleaf pine. Solid structure, one large room on the ground floor with a sleeping loft above it, cut stone on the lower half, and heavy timber on the upper. The previous owner built it in the 70s, and it outlasted him by 15 years before Colin bought the property from the man's estate for less than it was worth, because nobody else wanted land that far from anything. He was 32 years old with no family that claimed him, no friends that knew where he lived, and no debts anyone could collect on. He kept a .308 Winchester Model 70 on the wall above the door, a Kel-Tec KSG bullpup shotgun on the rack beside it, an old Browning over-under in the closet, and 2 Springfield XD 9mm, one on his hip during the day and one on the nightstand after dark. Wood stove, propane generator, chest freezer full of venison, 4 months of dry goods in the back room. He had everything he needed and nothing he didn't. Before the cabin, he spent 11 years doing contract work for people who needed problems solved quietly and without documentation. He came into it the way most people in that line do, through a side door that opens when you're young and broke and happen to be good at very specific things. In Colin's case, those things were staying calm when other people weren't and shooting better than anyone he'd ever stood next to on a range. A man he knew, through another man he'd grown up with, made an introduction. That introduction became a job, and that first job became 11 years of work across 4 continents for clients that ranged from people he considered more or less legitimate to people he didn't think much about, because thinking about them wasn't part of what he was being paid to do. In 11 years, he was never identified, never arrested, never photographed in connection with any of it, and never failed to finish what he started. That last part mattered to him more than anything else, not for pride exactly, more because he understood that in his line of work, the people who didn't finish things had a tendency to not finish much of anything after that. The job he found himself thinking about most wasn't the hardest one or the most dangerous one. It was a contract in Oslo in February of his 4th year. A shipping executive named Brennan who worked for people moving things through ports that were supposed to be monitored. The client wanted it clean and quiet with nothing traceable. Colin spent 9 days in Oslo before he was ready. He watched Brennan eat breakfast at the same cafe 3 mornings running, tracked his route from the hotel to his office, noted which member of his security detail spent too much time on his phone. By the end of the first week, he knew Brennan's patterns better than Brennan did, and by day 9 he had his position selected and his angles confirmed, and there was nothing left to do but show up. He was on a rooftop, across from the parking structure Brennan used every morning at 7:15 when the sun came up on the 10th day. What he remembered about that morning wasn't the shot. The shot was clean and took less than a second and was exactly what it needed to be. What he remembered was the 20 minutes before it, lying flat on that rooftop in the February cold with the rifle settled and nothing left to manage. The city was waking up below him, lights coming on in apartment windows across the harbor. A woman walking a small dog along the waterfront path. A bread truck making deliveries to a cafe on the corner. The driver moving crates with the efficiency of someone who had done the same route every morning for years. He hadn't felt anything bad about what he was there to do. What stayed with him was the quality of the silence inside him during those 20 minutes, everything reduced to a single clear point, with nothing on either side of it mattering at all. He had never found that feeling anywhere else. He thought about it sometimes on quiet evenings in the cabin. He quit at 31, and it wasn't conscience that pushed him out, and it wasn't fear. The people hiring him had started skimming his payments, and twice in his last year, someone sent people after him once the job was done to avoid paying the full rate. He understood the logic of it. The first time it happened, he let it go. The second time was in a parking garage in Guadalajara, and 3 men came at him in a stairwell. He put all 3 of them down and walked to his car and drove to the airport. He called his contact from the departures terminal and said plainly that he was done, and that if anyone came looking for him over what happened in that garage, they would regret it. Nobody came looking. He flew back to the States and spent 2 weeks in a motel outside Little Rock, going through property listings until he found the Ozarks cabin, drove out on a Thursday afternoon, and made an offer before he got back in his truck. He closed 6 weeks later and moved in with 2 truckloads of gear and supplies and a clear idea of what he wanted the rest of his life to look like. Quiet, uncomplicated, nobody's problem. It had worked out mostly the way he planned, and he was fine with it, most of the time. The night everything changed. It was mid-November, and cold enough that Colin had the wood stove going hard, and both doors sealed against the draft that worked up through the hollow after dark. He was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a topographic map of the surrounding county spread out in front of him. An old habit he'd never broken. Outside, the wind was moving through the tops of the oaks in slow rolls, and the creek was running loud from 3 days of rain earlier in the week. He heard something at 11 o'clock, something moving through the north tree line, heavy, coming downhill through the timber without much care for how much noise it was making. Colin turned the oil lamp down and crossed to the window beside the front door and looked out into the dark. The motion light above the porch clicked on. What came out of the trees looked like a man, tall, well over 6 feet, built heavily through the chest and shoulders. He was coming down the slope with one arm pressed across his midsection and his other hand catching tree trunks at the wood's edge to keep himself going. Dark jacket with a tear across the left side of it, dark pants, boots that had put in serious miles. He reached the bottom porch step and stopped and stood there looking up at the motion light. Colin already had the KSG off the rack. He stood at the door and looked at the man on his steps, and then at the tree line behind him, and then back at the man. The jacket was torn and there was blood soaked dark into the fabric on his left side and across the back of his right hand. Real damage. Then the man looked up at the cabin, and the porch light caught his eyes, and Colin felt the back of his neck go tight. The man's eyes were white. Not pale, not catching the light at a strange angle. White all the way through, flat and solid, without any of the usual architecture eyes were supposed to have. Colin opened the door anyway. The man looked at him, and then at the KSG, and his expression didn't shift at all. "You going to use that or not?" he said. His voice was deep and steady for someone who'd been using trees to stay upright coming down a hill. Colin lowered the shotgun a few inches. "Well, that depends on what you want. Somewhere to be that isn't out there." Colin looked at the tear in the jacket and the blood soaked into it. "How bad is that?" "Bad enough." Those white eyes held on him. "You going to let me in?" Colin stood in the doorway for a moment. In his previous life, a bleeding stranger at the door at 11 at night was almost always the start of a problem you didn't want. The correct move was to keep the door between you and whatever was about to happen. He knew that. He also knew that whatever was standing on his porch right now wasn't something he had a category for yet, and he had never been able to walk away from something he didn't have a category for. He stepped back from the door. Up close and in the lamplight, there was more to notice. The markings on his throat and forearms looked like tattoos, but sat differently in the skin, deeper, part of the tissue rather than applied to the surface. Dense geometric patterns running along the lines of muscle and bone, old-looking, in a way that had nothing to do with the man's age. When he pulled the torn jacket off and set it carefully on the table, the damage underneath was clear. 4 parallel gashes across his left ribs, deep, already clotted but not clean. A bad bruise spreading across his right shoulder, both sets of knuckles split and swollen. He'd given back whatever he'd received from the look of it. Colin pointed him to the heavy wooden chair beside the wood stove and got the first aid kit from under the sink and set it on the table along with the bullet. The man looked at the whiskey first and picked it up and drank from it and set it back down, then looked at the first aid kit. "I heal faster than you do," he said. "Cleaning it would help, though." "Good for you," Colin said. He sat across from him and opened the kit. He looked at the markings on the man's arms properly now that his jacket was off. Up close, they were even less like tattoos than they'd appeared at the door. The lines ran deep, and the edges were precise, and the patterns had a logic to them that felt like language rather than decoration. "What the hell are those?" he said, nodding toward the forearms. The man glanced down at them. "Lineage. Every dogman carries them. They record where your blood comes from, which line you belong to, what your people have done going back as far as the line goes." He turned one arm over briefly. "Someone who knows how to read them can tell more about you from these than you might want known." Colin handed across a bottle of antiseptic and some gauze. "Dogman," he said. "That's what I am." Colin sat back in his chair and looked at him. He'd grown up in rural Arkansas, and the stories were part of the landscape out there, passed around at gas stations and diners by people who were completely certain of what they'd seen. He had filed all of it away, under things he didn't know enough about to have an opinion on. He was forming one now, and it was changing the shape of the next several hours considerably. "All right," he said. "Walk me through what that means. Because I'm looking at a man with white eyes and marks on his skin that aren't tattoos sitting in my kitchen at 11 at night bleeding on my chair, and you're telling me you're something I heard stories about around a campfire when I was 12. The man looked at him for a moment. "You believed those stories?" "I believed the people telling them." Colin picked up his coffee. "There's a difference." Something shifted slightly in the man's expression. Not quite a smile, close to one. "My line is old," he said. "Older than most. We've been moving through human spaces for a long time, long enough that we learned early how to do it without drawing attention." He pressed the gauze against his ribs. "Most dogmen stay in full form their entire lives. My bloodline has always been able to shift between forms. Human, full dogman, anywhere between. We've been doing it long enough that it's second nature." "The eyes," Colin said. "They carry over. In both forms. White in this one, red in the other. It's the one thing we can't change regardless of what we look like." He turned one hand over and looked at the markings on his forearm. "The marks carry over too. In full form they show through the fur. Most people aren't looking closely enough to notice." Colin thought about that. "And the marks. You said lineage. Every line has its own patterns. Mine show where my blood comes from going back further than I can personally account for. The older the line, the more complex they are." He glanced at his own forearm. "Mine are fairly complicated. How old is your line?" The man looked at him across the table. "Old enough that putting a number on it tends to make people uncomfortable." "I'm hard to make uncomfortable." "I noticed." He picked up the whiskey again. "Let's say my bloodline has been walking around in human skin since before most of the cities you've been in were built, and leave it at that." Colin looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his own coffee and found it cold and drank it anyway. He looked at the jacket folded carefully on the table, the quality of the construction, the wear on it that said it had been well used over a long time. "How long have you been passing as human?" "Long enough that it's not really passing anymore." He set the bottle down. "My line doesn't think of it as pretending to be something we're not. We're both things. We've always been both things. And the others like you, your bloodline. There aren't many of us left. The old lines are rare." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. Most dogmen in this country belong to younger lines that never develop the shift. They stay in full form, stay in deep wilderness, stay away from people as much as they can manage. Colin nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "What happened to you?" The man pressed harder against the gauze. "A pack found me 2 days north of here. I've been moving since." He glanced at the window facing north and then back at Colin. 5 of them, 2 males and 3 females. They've been tracking me and they'll find this place before morning." "Why are they after you?" "There was a female in their pack who wanted out. The alpha claimed her when she was young, before she had any say in it. I heard about her situation through some people I know and went and helped her leave, got her clear and pointed her toward people who could get her somewhere safe." He paused. "The alpha sent the pack after me instead of going after her. I was counting on that." Colin looked at him. "You drew them off her on purpose. She needed time to get clear." He said it the same way he'd say he took a certain road because it was faster. No weight on it, no performance. Colin had spent a long time reading people, and this man wasn't putting anything on. He filed that away alongside the fact that he had chosen a stranger's front door instead of 40 miles of dark timber, which meant he had some reason to think this particular door was worth the risk. "You got a name?" Colin said. "Tough." "Colin." He leaned back in his chair. "That a first name or a last name?" "Just a name." "All right, just a name." Colin stood and picked up the topographic map from the table and spread it flat. "Tell me how they're going to come at this place." Tough pressed the gauze more firmly against his ribs and looked at the map. "The 2 males will lead from the north. The bigger one comes straight. He's the enforcer, probably close blood to the alpha. The second male angles right to flank." He pointed at the creek line on the east edge of the property. "The females are quicker, and they think more during a hunt. They'll use whatever cover is on the edges while the males pull your attention forward. That's how this pack runs it." "They communicate during the approach?" "Vocalizations. Owl calls in this kind of terrain this time of year. One answered by another from a different direction means they're set up and about to move." Colin traced the north face of the property with his finger, the timberline, the creek to the east, the limestone bluff to the west, dropping into the hollow. He thought about the angles and where he'd want to be. "How do I put one down?" he said. "High center mass or the head. They can take a hit and keep going so you don't stop shooting until they're finished. Don't make the mistake of thinking 1 round is enough." He looked at Colin steadily. "What are you working with?" Colin told him about the Model 70 in the Springfields and what else was in the cabin. "The 308 will work," Tough said. "It'll take more than 1 round, but it'll do the job if you're putting them in the right place." He shifted the gauze and checked it. The females are faster than the males and smarter about ground. If one gets inside your reach, it becomes a different problem. They go for the throat and the inner arm. Colin stood and went to the gun cabinet. He took the Model 70 down from the wall and slung it, and then picked up the KSG and held it out toward Tough and looked at his hands and the size of them and put it back. He went to the closet and brought out the Browning over-under instead, 12 gauge with a wide stock and a generous trigger guard. He held it out and Tough took it, broke it open, checked the chambers and snapped it shut, all of it easy and practiced. 2 shots, Colin said. Tough looked at him over the barrel. "I'm aware of how a double barrel works." Colin leaned against the gun cabinet. "You handle that like you've been around firearms a while." "I have." "How long is a while?" Tough set the Browning across his knees. "Long enough that I've seen them go from flintlocks to whatever that is," he said. nodding toward the KSG on the rack. "I've been a lot of places over a long time. You pick things up." "Apparently." Colin checked his Springfield and put 2 spare magazines in his jacket pocket and pulled his jacket on. He looked at Tuff's torn and bloodied jacket sitting folded on the table. "You're going to want that back on before we go out." Tuff picked it up and pulled it on carefully over the fresh gauze, the tears in the fabric hanging open but the jacket on. He stood from the chair, all 6'5" of him, moving carefully but steady enough. Colin went to the shelf beside the door and grabbed 2 small radios, checked the batteries on both and handed one across to Tuff. "1 click means you're good. 2 means you need me back at the cabin fast. You hear me key twice. It means I've got eyes on something and I'm about to move." He clipped his own to his collar. Tuff turned the radio over in his hand and clipped it to his jacket without any questions about it, which Colin appreciated. "I'm going out the back and coming around through the south timber," Colin said. "I need you on the front porch, north side, and nothing gets to the door." Tuff nodded and picked up the Browning. Colin opened the back door and felt the cold come in off the hollow. He looked back at Tuff once. "When this is done, I want to hear about whatever world it is you come from. All of it." Tuff looked at him with those white eyes. "That's a long conversation." "We'll have time," Colin said, and went out into the dark. He came around the south side of the property through the timber, taking his time, keeping the wind in his face. The hardwoods had dropped their leaves and the moon was giving him just enough through the cloud cover to make out shapes at distance. He found his way to a limestone outcrop 60 yards south of the cabin that gave him a clean angle on the north face of the clearing and the tree line beyond it, and settled in behind it with the Model 70 across the rock. He got his breathing under control and kept his eyes moving in a slow sweep and cleared everything else out. Just the ground in front of him and the angles and what was coming. At 11:47, an owl called from up on the north ridge. About 14 seconds later, something answered from the east, down along the creek bottom. He keyed the radio clipped to his collar twice. 1 click came back from the direction of the porch. The first shape came out of the north tree line, and Colin's picture of the situation updated completely. 7 feet at least, massively built through the chest and shoulders, dark fur, moving on 2 legs in a low forward crouch with a long muzzle extended and pale eyes catching what little moonlight there was. Behind it, and spread 15 yards to the right, a second one came out of the timber, slightly smaller, but built the same way, pushing out wide to flank. From the east along the fence line, a third shape was cutting low and fast along the brush line, using every bit of cover between itself and the north side of the cabin. They were good, coordinated, patient, running the approach exactly the way Tuff had described it. Colin appreciated that even from 60 yards out in the dark, with a rifle on them, he put the crosshairs on the lead male's chest and pressed the trigger. The shot broke across the hollow, and the round hit the male dead center and blew straight through him, the exit tearing a fist-sized hole out the back that sprayed dark against the pale frozen grass. The force of it drove the animal back a full step, and then its legs quit completely, and it went face first into the ground and didn't move. The second male broke left the instant the shot went off, fast, faster than Colin expected, cutting hard toward the west fence line in a diagonal sprint that covered ground fast. Colin swung the rifle hard to follow it, and lost it for a half second behind a stand of brush, and picked it up again at the wood's edge, going at a dead run, covering the last 30 yards to the timber in long driving strides. He led it, put his first round into its back haunches, and the animal's rear legs went out from under it, and it went sideways into the frost hard enough to skid. It caught itself on its front limbs and kept driving forward anyway, dragging itself toward the tree line with its back legs trailing and its front limbs churning, still covering ground, still refusing to quit. Colin worked the bolt. The second round went through the back of its skull as it reached the wood's edge and tried to pull itself into the brush. It dropped with its front half in the timber and its back half in the clearing and stayed there. From the direction of the porch, the Browning went off once, sharp and flat in the cold air. Something answered it that was deep and wet. 2 seconds of quiet. The second barrel fired. He keyed his radio. Tough. 2 seconds of silence that felt longer than that. 1 click came back. He put his attention on the east fence line, looking for the third shape, the one that had been cutting along the brush line. He swept the open ground between the fence and the cabin and found nothing moving, and shifted his scan to the limestone outcrop to his left and the stand of cedars beyond it, and found nothing there either. The list of places it could be was getting very short. Something came over the top of the limestone from directly behind him, hit the ground 8 feet to his right, and was already moving when it landed. He rolled left and came up with the Springfield because there was no room to bring the rifle around, and found himself face to face with one of the females. She was lower to the ground than the males, and built leaner through the body, her fur so dark it was nearly black against the grey of the frozen ground. Her eyes were pale yellow, almost colourless, and she was watching him with a stillness and focus that had nothing frantic in it at all. She'd worked all the way around the south approach in the dark and come over the back of the outcrop while his attention was on the north, and she'd done it without making a sound he'd heard. That had been the plan from the beginning, not a reaction to the shooting. An actual plan she'd been running since before the males even stepped out of the tree line. She was the most dangerous thing out here tonight, and she knew it. He got 1 round off as she committed. It caught her and rocked her half a step, but she'd already left the ground. Her full weight hit him and drove him off his feet and slammed him into the frozen ground hard enough to stagger his vision. She went straight for his throat. He got his left forearm up across her muzzle before her jaws snapped closed and locked every bit of strength he had into holding it there, driving his elbow up hard under her chin to keep her head back. Her claws raked across his left side and punched through his jacket, and the ribs underneath sent up a white hot flare that nearly broke his grip. He got the Springfield jammed into the space between her front legs, with the muzzle pressed hard against her rib cage, and fired. She bore down on his forearm harder, her jaws working against the bone, and he fired again, a third time. She made a sound low in her chest that he felt through his entire body, and her weight started shifting. He fired the 4th round point blank into her rib cage, and she went completely still on top of him all at once, every muscle releasing at the same moment, hundreds of pounds of dead weight pinning him flat to the frozen ground. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the grey, overcast sky with her across his chest. He took a moment to realize how alive he felt. He had missed the killing. Then he pushed her off and got to his feet. His forearm was bleeding through his jacket sleeve where her teeth had found the edge of it before he got his arm fully across. The cut wasn't deep. His ribs on the left side were sending up a signal that he acknowledged and set aside for later, because there was nothing to be done about ribs in a field. His breathing was even, and they were holding together. He reloaded the Springfield and did a full slow scan of the tree line in every direction. To the east, moving away through the dry leaves at a pace that suggested it had absolutely no intention of slowing down. Something was putting every yard it could between itself and this property. He walked back to the cabin. He heard it before he came around the corner. Low and resonant. A sound that went past his ears and arrived somewhere behind his sternum. Then the sharp crack of wood splintering, a section of the porch railing giving way all at once, something heavy hitting the frozen ground below the deck with enough force that he felt it through his boots. He came around the corner of the cabin with the Springfield up. Tuff was in the yard just off the porch, and he was not the man who had sat across Colin's kitchen table an hour ago. He was close to 7.5 feet, massively broad through the chest and shoulders, dark-furred, long muzzle. The same flat white eyes that once looked at Colin were now bright red. The torn jacket was gone, shed in the shift. One of the females was on the ground directly in front of him, finished. What was left of the porch railing was in pieces scattered across the yard. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Colin lowered the Springfield. One ran east. Tuff looked out at the dark tree line. "She will go back to the Alpha and tell him what it cost," he said. His voice in this form was deeper and rougher, but the same measured quality ran through it. "This Alpha calculates. He sent 5 and got 1 back. He'll move on and find something else to put his energy toward. You sure about that? Mostly. He looked down at the fresh claw marks across his left forearm, new damage, layered over what was already there. We stay aware for the next few weeks either way. Colin looked around the clearing. 4 down. The hollow had gone quiet in the way it does after something loud has happened in it. Everything holding still, while the all clear works its way back through the surrounding timber. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table and cleaned and wrapped his forearm from the first aid kit and taped his ribs as well as he could manage, and made a note to himself to breathe with some care for the next week or so. After a while he heard the front door, and when he looked up, Tuff was standing in the doorway in his birthday suit, every last stitch of clothing gone, the shift having apparently taken everything he was wearing straight along with it. Colin looked at him for exactly 1 second, and then looked back down at the first aid kit. "I'm going to need you to go back outside," he said. "It's cold outside." "I'm aware of that." Colin stood and went to the loft ladder and climbed up and came back down with a pair of sweatpants and a flannel shirt and a pair of wool socks, and held them out in the direction of the doorway without making full eye contact with it. "The shift does that every time. Every time. That's going to be a recurring problem." He set the clothes on the table and turned back to the first aid kit while Tuff got dressed. The sweatpants were about 4 inches too short, and the flannel shirt pulled hard across the shoulders, but it was a significant improvement over the current situation. Tuff sat back down in the heavy chair and picked up the bullet and finished what was left in it and set the empty bottle on the floor. "The jacket," Colin said. "That's a loss." Tuff sighed. "It was a good jacket." "How long did you have it?" 11 years. "You had that jacket for 11 years and always had the time to take it off before a shift." "That's impressive." Tuff chuckled a little. "Yeah, I guess that's right. Some situations require sacrifices, I suppose." Colin looked at him. "I'll add it to the list of things we need to sort out tomorrow." He closed the first aid kit and leaned back in his chair. "You said when this was done." Tuff looked back. "I did. So talk." Tuff leaned forward with his forearms on his knees. "There's a whole world running alongside the one most people know about. Thousands of species and threats, things that have been here long before humans were and learned early how to stay out of sight. Dogmen are one small part of it." He turned one hand over and looked at the markings on his forearm. "On the supernatural side, you've got witches, and I don't mean the kind people dress up as in October. I mean actual practitioners who've been operating in the dark longer than most governments have existed. Vampires, which have nothing to do with the movies. They're fast and they're smart, and they've been managing their exposure to the human world for centuries. Ghouls, warlocks, things that used to be human and aren't anymore in any way that counts." He paused. "Then you've got the cryptid side of it. Wendigos in the northern timber states, solitary and territorial, and the worst thing I've personally had a bad night because of. Googway in the deep Appalachian wilderness, which most people have never heard of and the ones who have usually wished they hadn't. Bigfoot, which is not one species but several, spread across every major wilderness area on the continent. Yeti in the mountain ranges. Gnomes in the sewer systems of half the major cities in this country, which sounds ridiculous until you find out what they do to people who wander into their territory. Dogmen, obviously. Skinwalkers in the southwest." He looked at Colin across the table. "Europe has its own inventory going back thousands of years. Asia has things without English names. The ocean has things nobody has fully documented because nobody who gets close enough comes back with anything useful. We are talking about thousands of species and threats living alongside 8 billion people who have absolutely no idea. Most of them want to keep it that way, just as much as we do. It's the ones that don't that become Harlan's problem, and now, potentially yours." Colin looked at him. "So who is Harlan?" Tuff picked up the empty bottle, looked at it, and set it back down. "He runs an independent operation. No government connection, no organizational name, Nothing written down anywhere you'd ever find it. He's been doing it for a long time. Long enough that nobody currently working for him knows exactly when it started or who started it before him. He paused. There's a thought among some of the people in his network that Harlan inherited the whole thing from someone before him, that the operation is older than he is. I don't know if that's true. I've never asked, and he's never said. What does the operation actually look like? Colin said. How does a job come to him? He has people embedded in places where strange things get reported. County sheriffs, rural doctors, park rangers, 911 dispatch operators in areas where the calls don't always make sense. When something comes in that doesn't fit any normal explanation, someone in that chain who's on Harlan's payroll flags it, and it works its way back to him. Regular people never know Harlan exists. They just know that whatever was happening stopped happening. Tuff looked at the window. He identifies the problem, finds the right people for it, and coordinates the response. Sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's several. Depends on what the job requires. Payment, Colin said. Cash, always. Half up front and half when the job is done. No accounts, no paper trail, nothing that connects back to anything. Tuff looked at him. He's never shorted anyone, and he's never sent anyone into something without telling them as much as he knew going in. In this world, that makes him unusual. Colin thought about that last part for a moment. In his previous life, the people hiring him had been reliable right up until they weren't. The idea of someone who operated cleanly and consistently in a world this complicated was either very reassuring or too good to be true, and he hadn't decided which yet. What is he? Colin said. Human? Tuff was quiet for a moment. As far as I can tell, but he's been deep in this world for a very long time, and that tends to leave marks on a person. He turned one hand over on the table. I'll let you form your own opinion when you talk to him. How does he find his people? Word of mouth, referrals from people he already trusts. Tuff held his gaze. I've been telling him about you for 6 months. Colin looked at him. 6 months. I move through these hills regularly. I notice things. He said it without any apology in it. A man living alone on 40 acres out here with your background, keeping to himself, not bothering anyone. Harlan has a use for that type. Colin sat with that for a moment. 6 months ago, hearing that would have put him into a very different kind of response entirely. Sitting at his own kitchen table tonight with a wrapped forearm and 4 bodies to deal with before the ground froze, he found he was more curious than bothered. And you, he said, where do you fit? I take work from Harlan when it suits me. Tracking mostly, intelligence, getting into situations that require a different set of options than a human brings. He looked at the empty bottle on the floor. I've been doing it alone. It's harder alone. Colin looked at him across the table. That why you came to this specific door? Partly. Tuff met his eyes. I needed somewhere and I knew about you. But also, yes, someone with your background working alongside someone with mine covers ground neither one of us covers alone. Harlan has been looking for that combination for a while. Colin looked at the map on the table and then out the window at the dark clearing and thought about 11 years of work and the feeling that came with it, and 2 years since then, with that feeling completely absent, and the fact that tonight, for the first time in 2 years, it had come back, clean and immediate, and exactly the way he remembered it. I'll talk to Harlan, he said. I'll make the call tomorrow. Colin stood and got his jacket back on. He looked over at Tuff sitting in the heavy chair like he'd always occupied it, the empty bottle on the floor beside him, wearing sweatpants that stopped mid-shin, and a flannel shirt that looked like it was reconsidering every decision it had ever made. You'd need somewhere to stay. Tuff looked around the cabin slowly, at the loft, at the wood stove, at the chair. He looked back at Colin. Loft work? It works fine. Something close to a smile crossed Tuff's face briefly and was gone. Then we have something to talk about. Outside, the cold had settled hard into the hollow, and the creek was running, and somewhere east of the property line, The one that got away was still moving through the dark timber, putting as much distance as it could between itself and whatever had just happened on this particular piece of ground. In the morning, there would be 4 bodies to deal with before the frost broke, and after that, a phone call to make. And a world considerably larger than the one Colin had thought he'd been living in to start figuring out. He was already looking forward to it.